This lecture is the third in our series on Chapter 10 from our Apes book, and the topic today is forests. So first of all, forests come in many different types. There are 4 different biomes we're going to discuss, 4 different biomes that represent forest type environments. The first one is the tropical rainforest, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's the upper right-hand picture. Tropical rainforests are characterized by high precipitation, between 300 and 400 centimeters per year. They also have warm temperatures year-round, and the nutrients, a key point here, the nutrients in a tropical rainforest are stored in the biomass, meaning the plants and the trees themselves, not in the soil. So as soon as something decomposes, the nutrients are released to the soil, and then the plants and trees immediately absorb those nutrients. So the soil itself actually has very little nutritional value for growing crops or things like that. Now, tropical rainforests are obviously found in the tropics, which is the band of latitudes that's between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. 30 is approximate. It's actually probably more like 23 degrees, I think, 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator, and that's considered the tropics. Now, the second type of forest biome we have is called the temperate rainforest, which many of you may not have heard of, and very few people have ever visited. Temperate rainforests are found north of 23 degrees north and south of 23 degrees south, so they're in the temperate zone, which is where we live in California. Temperate rainforests are characterized by moderate to high precipitation, between 200 and 300 centimeters per year, so less than tropical rainforests. And the temperature there varies with the seasons. They tend to be cooler than tropical rainforests, and temperate rainforests are found only in very small patches in certain areas, so along the coast of North America, sort of in the northern California, Oregon region, the coast of South America, and the coast of Australia. Those are the only places we find temperate rainforests around the world. And they're found in those areas because all of the moisture from the ocean allows the rainforests to form right along the coast there. It's sort of the rain shadow effect. So those rainforests are typically bordered by mountains, and as the moisture from the ocean moves inland, the rain is dropped right along the coast there. As the air rises, the vapor condenses and the rain falls right along the coast, and then as the air moves over those coastal mountains, we get a dry area on the opposite side. Now, 2 other types of forests. We have, first of all, the temperate deciduous forest, which should be very familiar to you guys. This is a typical New England leaves turn red in the fall sort of forest. In the picture you can see there on the right, it's a classic type of deciduous forest. Now, deciduous forests, temperate deciduous forests, receive moderate precipitation between 100 and 220 centimeters per year, and the temperatures vary by the season. So warm in the summer, cold in the winter. Oftentimes in the winter, actually, the trees lose all of their leaves, and we end up with snow. And these forests, temperate deciduous forests, have a well-developed topsoil, or horizon, because as the leaves fall every year and decompose, the nutrients from those leaves soak back into the soil, and so we get this very nice thick layer of topsoil, which is a mixture of organic material and sand, silt, and clay. Temperate deciduous forests are great forests for growing things. The final type of forest we're going to discuss is a coniferous forest. It's also known as a boreal forest. Now, boreal forests are forests that are found in the northern latitudes. So these are much farther north than temperate deciduous forests, or you would also find them farther up a mountain. I know when we were up in Big Bear, around 6,000 to 7,000 feet, we saw deciduous trees. When we got up to our campsite, which was more around 8,000 feet elevation, we saw only coniferous trees. So a coniferous forest, these are trees that do well in cold temperatures, and they keep their needles year-round. So they don't tend to shed all their needles in the fall or anything like that. These are also known as evergreens. And the reason they're called coniferous trees is because they form pine cones of some kind that bear the seeds. And that picture in the bottom towards the left of the page is a picture of a typical coniferous forest. Now, forests also vary based on age. We can have, for the first type is called the old growth forest. These are forests that have not been cut, or they have not been cut in like several hundred years, or they've never been cut by humans. So regenerated means that maybe they were farmed by humans for logs 200 or 300 years ago, but they haven't been disturbed since. And these are typical old growth forests. Old growth forests are great because there's usually a wide diversity of trees of all different ages, and some of the oldest and most mature trees form very great habitat for a lot of different types of birds, small animals, things that live in the forest. Now, we have a second type that's called secondary growth forests. Secondary growth forests are the type of forests that develop after the trees have been removed by humans. So let's say 100 years ago we came in, we clear-cut an area, we allowed the forest to regrow. We would consider that a secondary growth forest. So it hasn't been around long enough to be called an old growth forest, but it is still a good looking forest. It can be used by animals for habitat. The third type of forest is what some people would argue is not even really a forest. It's called a tree plantation. Now, a tree plantation is an area of land that's managed specifically for the purpose of harvesting trees, and tree plantations typically have uniform age, means they're all the same age. Typically it's just one species of tree, and that there's very low biodiversity. Now, an example of a tree plantation would be like a Christmas tree farm. You know, there are people who grow Christmas trees and they grow them in a 10 or a 20-year cycle. They have these big, huge areas of land where they're growing Christmas trees for people to harvest at Christmas time. And the tree plantation would have only Christmas trees, all of the same age, and then the only animals you would find there are animals that can live in and around Christmas trees. So the best type of forest for biodiversity is going to be the old growth forest. The second best is going to be the secondary growth forest because you still get a diversity of trees and some diversity of age there as well. The tree plantation is going to be the worst type of forest for biodiversity. Now, what are some ecosystem services we receive from forests? Well, first of all, forests help moderate the climate because they provide shade and they release water through transpiration. They help keep an area cool, much cooler than it would normally be. So therefore, one of the effects of removing a forest or clear-cutting a forest is that the temperature in that area is going to go up. It's going to increase. The second thing that forests do is they reduce soil erosion. The roots of the trees help keep the soil bound together and intact so that when there's a large windstorm or a large flood, the soil doesn't wash away. This helps preserve the topsoil intact, which means that we end up with better nutrient quality there for the other things that grow in that forest, like the small plants or the new saplings, the new trees that are growing. Now, the surface litter that's provided by some types of forests, like temperate deciduous forests, the surface litter is another name for the leaves that fall to the ground. This improves the soil's water holding capacity, which means that that soil can then absorb water much better and store that water for later use, which allows more plants to be able to grow in it. The surface litter and the stems and trunks of the trees will slow down surface runoff, which again helps prevent soil erosion. So whenever an old tree dies and falls over, the fact that that trunk is laying on the ground is going to prevent the soil from washing away. Now, tree roots, not only do they reduce soil erosion, but they also help increase the infiltration of water into the soil, because as tree roots push their way through the soil, they break it up and provide air spaces. So then when it rains, water can soak down into the soil even better, and combined with the surface litter, we end up with very moist, very rich soil that's very good for other things to grow in it. Trees themselves help purify air and water by absorbing and re-releasing water, and by absorbing air and storing some of the chemicals or toxins that might be in it. And as tree diversity in a forest improves, so as we go from maybe one species of tree to 2 to 3 to 4, the overall biodiversity of that forest also improves. So one of the reasons that we want to manage trees or manage forests in a way that promotes a large diversity of trees themselves is because then we know we also get a higher biodiversity of animals and other organisms that live in those trees. So, quiz question for you. If a forest is cut down and then regrows over a period of 150 years, it is known as is it an A, old growth forest, B, second growth forest, or C, tree plantation? And you can take a minute to think about that. I'm going to tell you the answer in just a minute. And the correct answer is B. A forest that's gets cut down and then regrows over a period of 150 years is known as a B, second growth forest. Now, if we were to wait another 50 to 100 years, that would then be considered an old growth forest. The border between them is kind of hazy, but typically they say more than 200 or 300 years is where you see an old growth forest. But in this case, 150 years, that's only a second growth forest. We've got to let it sit for a while longer. Now, there are several different ways that we harvest trees. It's a fact of life so far. Until we find something better, we need to cut down trees to use them to build houses and to build other buildings, to make paper, things like that. So, since we're going to be cutting down trees, how can we do it in a sustainable way? Now, the best method is called selective cutting. Selective cutting is where the forestry personnel walk through the forest and they choose the trees they're going to harvest. So they look around and say, okay, we're going to take that tree there, put an X on it. We're going to take this tree over here, put an X on it. We're going to take that tree over there, put an X on it. So they harvest only the mature trees and only the ones that suit their needs. That means that they leave all of the younger trees, as much underbrush as possible, and any of the older trees that may be too crooked or too old or too damaged to be used. So selective cutting is the best method because the majority of the forest remains intact and we only remove the trees we need. Now when I say best, I mean best with reference to biodiversity and with preserving the ecosystem services of the forest. It is not the best economically, and I'm sure you can understand that economically speaking, if we're going through and only cutting down 4 or 5 trees out of every 20 or every 50, it's going to be quite a task to drag those trees out of the forest. So selective cutting is great for biodiversity, it's great for maintaining ecosystem services, it's really bad for trying to be economically efficient. We have to cut down trees from a much wider area if we're going to do selective cutting, and it means that we end up spending a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how to remove those trees from the forest. So other methods that people sometimes use, here's an example actually of what selective cutting might look like. So you cut down specific trees and then allow regrowth to happen with many of the larger trees. Actually, in this example, I think they've cut down too many of these trees for it to be considered selective cutting, but you still leave a lot of mature trees there and you allow the smaller trees to grow up around them. Some of the other not so good methods of cutting, one of them is seed tree cutting. Now in seed tree cutting, the people who manage the forest do it's basically the opposite of selective cutting. Instead of going through and choosing the trees that they want to remove, they go through and choose the trees that they're going to leave. And so they'll choose a couple of each species in an area and cut down everything else. So they basically clear the forest out almost completely and leave behind only a few large mature trees that they hope will produce seeds and allow the rest of the forest to regrow. Now obviously this is more efficient economically, but if you're talking about a forest, you've got an area, where one day the trees are basically built so thick together that you can't even see the sky, and the next day you come through and you've got basically an open meadow with a few scattered trees in it. Not good for habitat, not good for ecosystem services. So seed tree cutting is more efficient economically, but it's not as good for biodiversity. The other method that is actually very not good, very bad, would be the clear cutting method. And if you see the picture there on the right, in a clear cutting method, you just come in and cut down everything. So the people who are harvesting the trees come in, they clear the entire swatch of land, and then they may plant seeds or bring in saplings to allow it to regrow if they are planning on using that land again. If they want to convert that land to agriculture, they would clear all of the trees and then they would pull out all the stumps and clear the underbrush and start growing crops there. So clear cutting basically completely destroys the forest habitat and converts it to another type of habitat. Could be an open meadow or it could be agricultural fields. So this would be another picture of what clear cutting looks like. This is a picture from your book. Rather than selecting which trees remain, you actually just cut all of them down, and then your regrowth, you end up with all small trees growing back. So why do we even do clear cutting? If it's so bad for habitat, why do we do it? So there's some very good reasons, actually. First of all, you get a much higher yield of timber. If you're talking economics, clear cutting a forest is the best way to get a lot of timber, and then you can use all of the smaller trees in the underbrush and can turn that into paper. It's much cheaper to do clear cutting, it's more efficient, and you can reforest the area with genetically improved trees. So suppose you have a new variety of pine tree that yields much stronger wood or a prettier color of wood. Go ahead and reforest with that pine tree and you're going to have a better crop in 20 to 50 years. It requires a lot less skill and planning to do clear cutting. You don't need to worry about having someone come through and survey your forest for you. You just cut everything down. And clear cutting ends up being good for species that require full or moderate sunlight. So these are plant species or animal species that do well in the open air with lots of sunlight. Some species are like that, and clear cutting is good for them. Now, the cons, or the drawbacks to clear cutting, first of all, it reduces biodiversity. It disrupts the ecosystem services being provided by the forest because in that particular region there's no longer a forest. It destroys habitat in the area where the clear cutting is done, and it also fragments the rest of the forest. So if you do a big swath of clear cutting in an area, the rest of the habitat around that is now fragmented. You've basically put a meadow in the middle of your forest. It increases soil erosion, and it increases sediment and water pollution and flooding, because as it rains now, instead of having the trees to hold all of the soil together, that water is going to run right off, carry the topsoil with it into local rivers or streams, and the additional runoff is going to raise the level of that stream much higher and much faster because the water won't be able to infiltrate into the soil as much. It's going to run off more quickly. So we end up with flooding in the stream and a huge influx of sediment and nutrients, which can cause other problems. And then you also lose the recreational value of that forest. So, which of the following is not a consequence of deforestation? This is sort of the idea of clear cutting. Clear cutting is a form of deforestation. If you allow the land, to have the trees grow back and become a forest again, then it wasn't really deforestation. But the process of clear cutting basically removes a forest from that area. So, which of the following is not a consequence of deforestation? Is it A, increased soil erosion, B, decreased soil nutrients, C, increased water temperature, D, decreased carbon dioxide released, or E, decreased biodiversity caused by loss of habitat? So I'm going to let you think for a minute about which one of these you think is the correct answer. Go ahead and pause if you haven't come up with your decision yet. And I'm going to reveal the correct answer in just a moment. So let's go through these one by one. First of all, we're looking for the one that's not going to happen if we cut down all the trees. So A, increased soil erosion. Soil erosion is going to happen, so A is true. That's not our answer. B, decreased soil nutrients. Well, all of the topsoil is going to wash away, so yes, our nutrients are going to decrease. B is not the correct answer. C, increased water temperature. Well, like we said, trees help moderate climate, so if we remove all the trees, the temperature of the area is going to increase, which means the temperature of our water is also going to increase. So C is a true statement. It's not our correct answer. Now D, decreased carbon dioxide released. So D is our correct answer. D is the correct answer. When we cut down all the trees in an area, we're going to have an increased amount of carbon dioxide released, not a decreased amount. And just to clarify with E, obviously, when we cut down all the trees, we're going to have decreased biodiversity caused by loss of habitat. So E is a true statement, which means it's not the correct answer. In this question, it's one of those backwards ones. We're looking for which of the following is not going to happen when we cut down all the trees. So E will happen, so E can't be one of our choices. Now, sustainable forestry. What is sustainable forestry? In a nutshell, it means that we are able to harvest the forest for lumber and preserve habitat. So, how do we accomplish this? First of all, the longer the rotation that you grow the timber on, the longer that forest has a chance to develop as habitat and function as habitat. So when we grow our timber on long rotations, like 50 years instead of 20, or 70 years instead of 50, we end up with better habitat in that area. Selective cutting and strip cutting are both very good methods of harvesting trees. We didn't talk about strip cutting, but basically you cut very long, narrow strips of forest and allow the forest to remain intact on either side. So it's kind of like clear cutting, but instead of clear cutting in a square, you might clear cut in like a very long piece of linguine. So a very, very long rectangle, long skinny rectangle, which minimizes the disruption to habitat, because if your strip is only 40 feet wide, animals can still cross back and forth over it and use it as habitat. So selective cutting, where you just choose the trees you want, or doing strip cutting are both good methods of sustainable forestry. Never do any kind of clear cutting on steep land. That will help prevent soil erosion. Make sure that you don't fragment the remaining blocks of forest, so maybe cut around the edges or do selective cutting, but keep the remaining blocks of forest intact. You can reduce road building into uncut areas. As much as we can keep forest from being broken down into smaller and smaller chunks, the better that forest will be for habitat. So rather than build roads into those areas, try and use machinery that will allow you to do harvesting without roads. Maybe helicopters, although that can be difficult. But maybe just don't build a road at all. Maybe just drive your trucks in along whatever trails you can find and then drive them back out. So no official road building. Another thing we can do is leave standing dead trees and timber that's fallen to the ground as habitat. There are lots of animals that will use a dead tree or a tree trunk as a place to live. And when we go in and remove all of that, we reduce the quality of the habitat. Finally, one of the best things we can do is begin to include the value of our ecological services in our consideration of the economic value of the forest. So asking questions like, how much money are we saving because this forest exists and is moderating the climate? Or how much money are we saving because this forest exists and is holding the soil together for us? Preventing erosion, preventing the stream from flooding. Those are all the kinds of questions we need to start asking. Finally, we can certify that timber is grown by sustainable methods. And people are starting to do that now. There's a group called the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, and you can go to Home Depot and buy FSC certified timber. So they have, all the different plywoods and 2x4s and all the different kinds of lumber you can buy. Well, choosing FSC certified lumber means that you're supporting sustainable forestry. So finally, some other ways we have of slowing down deforestation. We can reduce the need to harvest trees by, first of all, improving the efficiency of wood use. So what we look at now is up to 60% of the wood that we harvest is being wasted. And so reducing that waste and improving our efficiency are great ways of reducing our need to harvest trees. Finally, secondly, we can make paper from other materials. It's called tree-free fiber. So we can use agricultural residues like corn stalks to create paper, and you can go to the store and find, Barnes & Noble has different types of journals or notebooks that are made with tree-free paper. You can also use crops like kanaf. The picture on the right there is a picture of a stand of kanaf. Kanaf is a very fast-growing crop, and it's very fibrous and can be very easily converted into paper. So growing kanaf instead of growing trees and using kanaf for paper is a very good way, a very good substitute to traditional paper. We can recycle paper and buy recycled paper products, and that will also help reduce our need to harvest trees. And finally, like I said before, we can purchase lumber that has been harvested sustainably. So that concludes our lecture for today. If you have any questions, please email me anytime or ask in class. And this lecture is one of the ones I would recommend you spend some time watching because forests tend to come up on the AP tests quite often. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in class.